What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia.
And Victoria. We are two friends whose high school experience did not involve hand-to-hand combat, and for that we are grateful.
You wrote this, and I don't know if I am grateful, actually. I might have enjoyed that.
You want to do some hand-to-hand combat?
Yeah!
I specifically didn't write swords, because I know you do want you would have loved if our PE class was sword-related.
I would have. That's an excellent point. I do have very small hands. And very delicate forearms.
Sorry, I just imagine hand-to-hand combat where you're only using the hands. And it's like a really vicious patty cake.
Woo! We'd like to be your book friends, is what I was trying to say.
This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
And this week, we are finally talking about The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, a fantastical reimagining of Japan's invasion of China around World War II times. Plus, there's like a whole university origin story in the first half.
There will be spoilers ahead. If you are someone who really doesn't want a book spoiled before you've read it and you haven't read The Poppy War, please go ahead and hit pause now, come back later. But whether you've read it or not, you are welcome to the party, to the discussion here. And I think our end goal of the discussion today is to help inform you, dear listeners, if you haven't read this book, do you think it would be one you would benefit or enjoy reading?
Yeah, that is our final section, is like, who do we think would enjoy this book? Because there's a lot of discussion on like, is it good and why? So yeah, you might gain some insight if you don't mind a few spoilers. But again, it's based on history, so like, there aren't that many spoilers, but there are some. It's up to you. All that to say, if you would like to support the show, rate, review, subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on in your earbuds right now. If you go down to any book links in the show notes, that will go to our affiliate page on bookshop.org. Do not buy books from Amazon, please. Go to bookshop.org. It sources from independent bookstores, and we get a very small kickback when you buy any book there on our page. And then if you'd like to join the club, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. And you can get all of our archived episodes and our bonus content. Join the club. You read this first, like, I think maybe a year before I did?
Yes.
So it's been a minute for you.
I mean, I just finished the entire trilogy, like, a month ago.
Oh, okay.
A month and a half ago. Like, I finally read the third book, so, like, I have given myself time. I have given you time. In fact, I read this book when I was supposed to be reading books for your Octopus series. The Octopus books for the series, The Vampire and the Octopus.
Yeah.
And I had to be like, Julia, I had to read this Octopus book in 3 days. And she's like, you've had 3 months. And I'm like, I just read The Poppy War instead. So my memory was kind of fuzzy. I was like, I know I read this, but what was I doing? And I do use the Storygraph app frequently to record my reading, and thankfully I had written some notes in there that was helpful. And then I remembered I binged it on a flight, which is usually why I can't remember where I was when I read a book, is if I read most of it on a flight. I'm just like, there's no time, there's no space, there's just the metal box that I'm sitting in and this book. But yeah, I read, according to my Storygraph, if my data entry was accurate, I read all 527 pages in just under 10 days, which is pretty fast for me. And I gave it, at the time, a 4.75 out of 5, which, if for the, like, 7 people who follow me on Storygraph, I very rarely give out 5 stars. I use my own internal ranking. This is not, like, me trying to promote a book for folks to read. It's just my internal ranking of 5 stars is, I'm actually going to read this again. It's that good, which I don't reread very often. 4 stars is, like, this is really fantastic. I'm going to think about it a lot, and I'm going to recommend it to pretty much anyone who enjoys reading. 3 stars is like, this was a good book, and if someone likes this kind of thing, I'd recommend it, but it's not for everyone. 2 stars is like, there's something here, but I probably wouldn't recommend it unless someone like very nichely was into this thing. 1 star is like, I finished this book, but no one I can think of would like it. or
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed that I read it, which is like all 10 of those like trashy vampire books I read in 2022 during a little depressive episode. So 4.75 stars. For me, that was like a huge yes. And like all artifacts point to the fact that, wow, I must have really enjoyed this. But in the time since, I've read the rest of the series. I've read lots of reviews because I've had a lot of conflicting thoughts about the series. And I'm like, what do other people think? Because sometimes I don't trust my own opinions, which is why I have a show about my opinions on books. I don't know. It's helpful. Yeah. So I've had a good like 11, 12 months to sit with my opinions. And I still think it's a good read, but I think star rating it today as of recording, I'd probably put it at the solid 3. When we wrote these show notes initially a little bit ago, I put 3.75. So it's just ticking down as I spend more time thinking about it. It's difficult because like for me, the line level writing is so good. It kept me hooked. I was like, I'm on a plane and I could be listening to podcasts or doodling in my journal or like doing work. And I ravenously read this book the entire way there and the entire way back on a trip. So it really hooked me in. But when I step back just a little bit, I feel like there's some inconsistencies with the main character that we're going to get into. And truly just like an overwhelming number of characters and action to pack into a singular book. And I think a lot of my, wow, I love this was hopeful towards what the next 2 books would be that I won't get into in this episode because we are not spoiling books 2 and 3 for those who haven't read those yet. But for me, the whole trilogy, I think, paints a different picture on book 1 than I might have had at the end of book 1 before I had finished out the series. So anyways, overall, good experience reading, but on reflection, I have thoughts, which is why we're recording a podcast. So we can share with other people who might have thoughts, and maybe you can share your thoughts back with us so we can all think together.
That is super interesting to me that, like, the immediate binge reading experience of this book, part of what's enjoyable is the promise that the first book presents of what the series will be. And so if you were let down by the rest of the series, you no longer have that promise, and you know it's not going to be fulfilled, and that changes your opinion of the first one.
I was like, ooh, where could this go? And the way it went, I was like, okay.
You mentioned not trusting your own opinions, and I feel like sometimes I come out so strong that I worry that I, like, change your opinions. And you do a very good job of pushing back on me, and I feel like you've learned that over the years, that, like, you can and should. This is one of those times where I'm like, I'm really looking forward to hearing where you're at now, because I'm worried I have, like, corrupted you. So, okay. I knew, like, from friends, I feel like enough people have read this book and recommended it to me. I knew that this book was sort of inspired by the Sino-Japanese Wars kind of in general. There's a couple of them. I don't know the old ones very well. I really only know, like, the World War II stuff. What I didn't realize is this was kind of a very inaccurate way to describe it is a shot-for-shot remake of Chinese history. It's like an actual retelling of Chinese history from World War II to the Cultural Revolution, roughly. I could tell in the first half of the book, I loved the first half. World building, it felt like historical fiction in the first half. You can tell that there's kind of a one-to-one between the places and the actual geography of China, right? So you've got China and Nikon. Is that how you would pronounce that? There's Mongolia, which is like the hinterlands in the book. There's Japan, which is Mugen. Like, it's literally described as the Bow Island. Like, and you see the map in the book, it's like the exact same shape. And then Taiwan is Spear, the like teardrop-shaped island. So you can see these one-to-one, you're like, oh, this feels like historical fiction. And so when they talked about the previous Poppy Wars, the previous Sino-Japanese Wars, I don't know them very well, and so I couldn't tell if it was exactly what had happened or not. I wasn't looking for historical touch points, but as soon as we got to... Well, first of all, when they take the capital, I knew that happened. But the thing that made me go like, wait a second, was when they go down to Coeur d'Alene, they mention that the Hesperians have left a couple priests to take notes on what's happening. I was like, wait a second, that's where a lot of the records of the brutality of the Japanese come from is like a couple little European priests taking notes. And so I was like, okay. Then when we got to the Golan Nice chapter, I was pretty disappointed, and I'm frustrated with myself that is the reaction I had when I'm reading about this, like, absolutely horrific brutality. That my first thought was like, oh, she didn't come up with anything new. I kind of hate myself for that. And I now know it was on purpose, but she was including so many, like, exact details from the massacre of Nanking, which was the temporary capital of China during the war. And I learned a lot about that event in college. We spent a whole year talking about war. I don't know if I would recommend it, but one of the things that my undergrad university specialized in was kind of like some hidden histories from different parts of Asia. We studied from the book that R.F. Kuang literally read and referenced in order to write this part. The first time I learned about it, I was like so unbelievably horrified and like upset about how this history had gotten buried, and I feel like I had some of the rage at the time, and so then I'm reading it in a what I thought was a fictional novel, and I'm like, oh, this isn't fiction. I haven't been sold fiction. I've been sold a history with all the names changed, and we added some magic. So I felt kind of deceived, I guess. I felt like lied to a little bit. And I think some of that bitterness came through in our first conversations where I was like, this isn't original work. This is just history. I don't know. So I think have backed off of that a bit now. I think we both changed our opinions a bit.
I think we both had this really beautiful thing where you have a really strong opposite beliefs as someone, and you see the world very differently, but through conversation, you realize you might have more in common than you have in difference.
Look at us go. Modeling healthy
Civic
disagreement.
Discourse.
Yeah! Anyway, so I felt disappointed, but also I finished it quite easily. I didn't have any trouble finishing the book, which we know my brain can do when it gets bored. So I'm excited to get into this.
Me too. Rebecca F. Kuang is an American fantasy writer. She was born in Guangzhou, China, and immigrated with her parents to Dallas, Texas when she was 4 years old.
Wait, she grew up in Texas?
She did. She attended Georgetown for undergrad, where she was active on the debate team. And then Kuang had the opportunity to take a gap year and coach a debate team in China. And it was during that year that she reconnected with her grandparents, learned more about her family and cultural history, and decided that I don't have any homework because I'm on a gap year. Let me just make a goal of writing 2,000 words a day. So the first draft of this novel she wrote in like 3 months during that year. Like about a year later, got picked up by an agent and sold it within like 18 months of writing it when she was in her early 20s. Maybe she was 19. I don't remember. The culmination of all that writing became the Poppy War trilogy. And today we're talking about the first book of the trilogy, which was released in 2018. And then the second and third installments came out back-to-back 2019, 2020, respectively. I'll note, she wrote the first draft in 2015. So it was like a couple years from like all the publishing world stuff and writing the other trilogies. I imagine she just kept writing the entire time for them to be able to come all out. Boom, 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 boom. I don't imagine that she wrote all of The Burning God, which is a ginormous third installment, in like a year. I imagine that was all one project. But of course, Kuang, must also be doing other things to keep herself busy. She was busy earning degrees. Cambridge, Oxford, and now Yale. She is pursuing her PhD in East Asian languages and literatures. She's published numerous novels since then. She's also a translator and publishes academic pieces as well. So she writes a lot. I'm very excited. She just posted like the other day, like a picture of a Polaroid, and it was her sitting at her desk, and it was like the date. So April, whatever, 2024. Finished first draft of something about like the Taiwanese novel. Like she just didn't describe what it is, but she's like, this
Oh.
novel's from my grandparents. So I'm very
Oh.
curious to see what that becomes, if it's going to be like something like the Poppy War where we're like doing historical fantasy, or if she's going to go away from fantasy and write realistic. I don't know.
That's exciting. I mean, she just published one.
Yeah, she just had a book come
coming
out.
It's about a PhD student who has to go to hell to get his.
Yeah, you can tell that she's been in school for a while.
Yeah, like
August 2025.
so it's not out yet. She's doing promo for it. But yeah, it's like every single one of her works has to have some sort of harrowing university experience. And you're just like this girl's going through it. She can't escape.
Writing what she knows.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. Yeah, her one novel that doesn't take place with any sort of university tie-in is a author who's actively publishing.
Right. That's why I think I also loved the first half so much, because she's like in her bag when she's writing school. She's so good at it.
Refresh us if we haven't read it in a while. What happens in the Poppy War?
So the book is divided into two parts. The first half, we follow an orphan named Rin, Fang Runin. She's a foster child from the south of Nikan/China. She was fostered by opium smugglers who are not very nice. She manages to memorize a bunch of books, and get first place on the national college entrance exam. First place in her province, which guarantees her admission to the Sinagard military university, the top school in the country. Her tutor takes her there, and almost as soon as she starts school, she starts getting picked on by the Nepo babies that are there at every top school in the world. There's Neja? He's the son of the Dragon Lord. Good for him. And Venka, who are both from the capital. And then she also befriends their old classmate, who I think of as the supreme nerd of Sinagard. His name's Kate. He's a blast. Honestly, her only friend. And then there's also this older student who will be important later. He's from the island of Spear that was massacred in the previous war. His name is Alton. He seems to have these super combat powers, and everybody's obsessed with him, but he doesn't really talk to anyone. Okay, her combat teacher kicks her out of class basically just for being poor. Crazy. So she uses her rage to get the best grades in all of her classes and burn her uterus out of her body. We blow past that so fast, and then it's almost
There's so many things in this trilogy that you're like, wait, what? And we just move on. But that's one of them. And it's a character built, character shaping moment of oh, this is who Rin is. But honestly, I think my hypothesis is Kuang was one day thinking too hard about the logistics of some of the things that Rin has to do. And he's you know what? Rin can never have a period because we can't let that take away from her mental focus. She can't deal with cramps. We're going to come up with a reason. Whereas there's so many fantasy action. There's so many things that just disregard menstruation for women. The female lead just never has a bad cramp day. But I love she's we have to deal with this fact. We will create a whole scene that demonstrates her commitment.
Is it so that it guarantees she doesn't have children?
I think it might also to be closing that loop, because we do learn that she's a Spearly as well. Yeah, it gets rid of that possibility. There could be any continuation of their people. I think it also, this book included, has descriptions of sexual violence. And while Rin is less affected than some other female characters, it still allows an understanding that that could not it could not result in her ever getting pregnant.
Gotcha.
I think is trying to clear out those possibilities. But I think you're right. I think closing the loop on we can't have the two Spearleys that are left procreate.
Yeah. I could see someone coming to her and be like, but there's 2 Spearleys left. Like, they could just have babies.
It's her last edition.
Yeah.
Last editor note before she sends it off to print. It's like, and then she burns out her uterus.
She burns it away. It's wild. And then she tries to teach herself combat, and her spunk helps gain the attention of the quote-unquote lore teacher, who's always, previous to that, just seems to be getting high in trees all the time. His name is Zhang. He takes the shining to her, and he gives her this, like, super ancient meditative combat training that ultimately helps her beat Neja in the kind of end-of-year combat trials exams thing. She gets first place there. However, during this fight, she, like, awakens this, like, buried ancestral ability to, like, channel the power of this phoenix goddess, which is starting to clue us in, like, oh, she's probably from Spear. And so she goes to Zhang for help. He, it turns out, is also a shaman who can also channel gods. He's actually a super important one from, like, mythology, but they don't get into that too much in this book. He teaches her mainly how to be a shaman and not go crazy. That's, like, his only goal. Because it turns out there's this giant mountain filled with shamans who did go crazy and are now just, like, not even connected to their bodies anymore, and they're just, like, buried underground, because otherwise the gods would just, like, wreak havoc on the planet. Okay. Part 2 starts when war breaks out, and the Muganese invade Nikon, like, properly, and they march on the capital, commit a lot of brutal destruction. Rin and Neja are alone defending this single gate, and Neja gets injured. And so then Rin, in sort of her fear, is like, the only thing I have available to me is to access the Phoenix God, even though she doesn't really want to. And she just kind of, she doesn't know how to control it. She just kind of burns everything, which freaks her out because she doesn't know how to turn it off. And it freaks out the Mugen army so much that they, like, retreat and decide to come up with a different plan. As she recovers, she gets put in the psych, which I think is funny because it's just a different spelling for psych, like psychology, like P-S-Y-C-H. Like, you think of like psych ward, kind of. So it's like this faction in the military. They're very ridiculed. It's all made up of shamans from, like, around the empire. There's only like 7-10 of them, and it's run by Alton, the other Spearly, who we find out later was, like, experimented on. The reason he's alive after Spear was massacred is he and a few others were, like, experimented on and given heroin. And so he is deeply addicted. He's trying to gain them some recognition, so they do this operation against Mugen that seems successful, but then the retaliation is, like, bananas. And they get some reinforcements from Neja's, like, battalion or whatever, but it's not really enough, and he ends up dying through some shaman vision shit that I don't really have time to get into, because there's, like, a whole other universe to this, whatever.
It's, like, over 500 pages, so you're doing great.
Thank you.
Just getting this down to, like, a few minutes.
They figure out that the real target of the Muganese army, actually, while they're keeping people busy in Coeur actually, the real target is Golden-Nis, the temporary capital. And so the psych, like, hurries over there, and they arrive to, like, the more brutal destruction than you could possibly imagine. It's, like, creative. It's, like, evil creativity, where it's like they were having fun destroying all these people and, like, boiling babies and, like, just evil shit. And it's all based on stuff the Japanese actually did. So they find this, and they find a few survivors. Obviously, seeing something like that is going to create a lot of rage. Like, what else are you going to feel, really, in response to that? Alton's like, hey, Rin, we should, in order to fight back, we should go release all of the shamans that are buried underground that don't even have connection to who they are as people anymore, and just let them loose. It's like basically letting the entire pantheon of gods just, like, loose on the world. We should do that because I'll be able to control them Totally. 100% I'll be able to do it.
Great plan.
Great plan, bro. They release one, and he's bad enough because he's like the wind. They see Zhang, and Zhang is like, you guys are being dumb and you're too angry, and I'm gonna put myself back in here, thank you very much. And then they end up getting kidnapped and taken to the same facility where Alton was experimented on as a child. It's very bad, but he tells Rin how to get to Spear from there because it's right on the water. They have this beautiful dream together about old Spear, and they generate enough fire to like get them out of there, but Alton stays behind to basically suicide mission, try and kill everybody at that facility to enact the real revenge he kind of always wanted to do. And then Rin swims all the way to Spear, finds the underground temple to the Phoenix goddess, and she's like, I am so unbelievably angry. What can we do to make Mugen pay for what they did to Golden Niece? And the Phoenix goddess is like, I got you, girl. Let's explode a volcano and burn a bunch of people. Because that's what I do, is I burn. I'm a goddess of fire. And Rin is like, great. And so they do that. They kill a bunch of people, effectively ending the war. And then she gets rescued, because, again, shaman vision shit, they can find her. And then she is now the de facto commander of the Psych, and she is left to deal with, like, oh wow, I just committed genocide too! What does that make me? And that's where we're left.
Yeah.
At the end of this book. Anything important I left out?
No, this is a great refresher because there's a couple things that I might have spoiled forgetting where they happened.
Oh,
and so this was
yeah.
great to be reminded where our ending point is.
Where the cutoff is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think for a lot of readers, their rating of the book came down to whether or not that blend of historical and fantasy worked for them. If that felt like, oh, that's super cool, or that's really interesting, or I really appreciated that approach. And others who are like, this is not what I thought I was getting into, or I didn't like how it was handled, or I don't think it should have been done this way. So that's like one big divide. I think for others, their ratings, from what I was reading and what I was feeling too, this one was stronger for me, was their tolerance for the protagonist's like stubbornness, assholery, unlikability. Like some folks being like, did not finish, I could not stand Rin. And other people like myself, I'm like, I read the entire thing and I devoured it. And also I'm like, there's so much I don't like about her. Not just like I'm down for an unlikable character, an unlikable protagonist, we'll get into it. But that kind of like, are we at a place where we can even like get on board reading this much of Rin's perspective? But before we get into some of those main arguments for and against this book being really good or really mid or meh, let's look at the context in which Kuang wrote it and like why she wrote it. This informs our ability to determine if it was successful or not.
This information had a big impact on me, for sure. I felt less cheated because I was like, oh, I understand this journey that she was on. These are quotes that Kuang put in the end material of the second US printing. So this is sort of, the book has been out for a minute. She's heard some responses from people, or she's gotten some reader questions, and she's going to like provide additional information. These are some of the things she wrote about why she wrote these books. She says, I wrote The Poppy War after several long discussions with my Chinese grandparents and their experiences during World War II. The last few years, from publishing The Poppy War to finishing my master's thesis on the complicated remembrance of the rape of Nanking, to starting my master's in philosophy and Chinese studies at Cambridge, have been a long, often painful process of excavating both familial and national history to understand where we come from. It's a history that isn't often taught in American classrooms and which often isn't known even to members of the Chinese diaspora. I hope my work does a little bit to change that. So this book sort of assumes at its core that you as the reader don't know this history and are like learning it alongside her, feeling all these big feelings for the first time about like, why did no one tell me about this? oh my God, this is real. Like, this is horrifying. Why has this been buried? And like, I think in all fairness, that is probably true of like a good chunk of the American market where this book became a bestseller and who she was kind of had in mind when she was writing it.
Mm-hmm.
She was going on this journey of discovering this history and needed something to do with that feeling and that anger. And she's doing that thing where you learned something that you're like, oh my God, everyone needs to know this, and is bringing us in on that.
In an interview with NPR in 2020, so this is like after, like as the third book is coming out, she kind of now with a little bit more, even more space as she's like wrapped up the series and has like moved on to writing other books, she reflects even more on kind of where she was then versus later on. She says, I was writing from a place of rage and anger because I thought it was just astonishing and really tragic that something like this was not really talked about in the West, and also not really acknowledged or apologized for on the part of Japan. The journalist follows up with this. But she continues, she's no longer writing out of anger. For one thing, she learned how the Chinese Communist Party politicizes traumatic events like the Nanjing massacre to stoke nationalism, and she realized it could be dangerous to tell a revenge story where her main character destroys a whole country of perceived oppressors. So it seems like, I mean, it's told in summary from the journalist, but it seems like she's kind of had a change of like, oh, wow, this book really blew up. And to her credit, she didn't know it was going to be like this huge bestseller book that was like going to be read so far. I mean, she was 19 writing out of a place of anger and wanting to, and you can hear the anger coming through in the writing. Yeah, so this is in the Golan Niece chapter when Rin is processing what she's seeing. The cruelty could not register for her. Bloodlust, she understood. Bloodlust she was guilty of. She had lost herself in battle too. She had gone further than she should have. She had hurt others when she should have stopped. But this viciousness on this scale, wanton slaughter of this magnitude against innocents who hadn't even lifted a finger in self-defense, this she could not imagine doing. They surrendered, she wanted to scream at her disappeared enemy. They dropped their weapons. They posed no threat to you. Why did you have to do this? A rational explanation eluded her. Because the answer could not be rational. It was not founded in military strategy. It was not because of a shortage of food rations or because of the risk of insurgency or backlash. It was simply what happened when one race decided that the other was insignificant. The Federation had massacred Goldeness for the simple reason that they did not think of the Nakara as human. And if your opponent was not human, if your opponent was a cockroach, what did it matter how many of them you killed? What was the difference between crushing an ant and setting an anthill on fire? So you see her really wrestling with these big questions, like how do you grapple with history and anger when your people have been dehumanized and violated, and when there's been genocide, and like to be learning that as a young adult and realizing that is a core part of your cultural history and world history that impacts so much, and it has felt hidden from you or kept as like one paragraph in your history textbook, which is how I remember the rape of Nanking. I'm like, oh yeah, that was like one paragraph in like Japanese imperialism. It's understandable the place she's writing this from, I think, and you can see how that comes through. It can feel like it can feel understandable, but also feel like maybe it doesn't work for all readers who aren't there, right? Like maybe they're very familiar with this history, or maybe they aren't familiar, but this is the only way they're interacting with it, and we'll get into what kind of impact that might have, but yeah.
Yeah, something it kind of reminds me of is when you're in a writing workshop, and I feel like this is something we bring up sometimes. You're in a writing workshop and someone brings in a piece where you're having a really big feeling and you sit down and you write something to put that feeling somewhere. And then you bring that document to the writing workshop. Like, this would happen all the time. Someone goes through a breakup and the document is, the story or the poem they turn in is just raw emotion. It's so raw. You're like, I can't critique this in good faith because it's gonna hurt you because this is your heart on a page. These are just your raw feelings. It had kind of that feeling for me when I was reading it, where like if I had been handed this manuscript, I would have been like, this is an incredible first go at it. She had a lot to work through, and she was carrying this burden, and like I really empathize. I'm like, that's a huge thing to learn about yourself. And she wasn't thinking about like what genre does this need to be, or what market is this for, or she's not thinking about that shit, right? And we often get some incredible innovations from first timers who don't know that they're not supposed to do certain things, quote unquote. There isn't really anything that's like inadmissible, right? But sometimes there's like a reason certain things aren't done.
So one of the reasons people complain in reviews that they didn't like it was that it too closely resembled actual events of history and didn't feel like a distinct story. Or sometimes people are like, I was really excited for like all these fantasy layers, and I felt like the layer was too thin. Like the layer of fantasy on top of the historical story. And I think when you're saying, you know, there's quote unquote industry things that folks don't do, like we try to land more specifically in a genre to market it, but it's also kind of like what works. Like in a storytelling context, there is decisions to be made about, I'm writing historical fiction and I'm deciding which parts are fictionalized. Maybe I'm adding a new fictional character in this world with real people, but then you're really having to handle how you write about real people, and especially when you write about real victims. I feel like that's a little different too than like a historical figure like Mao Zedong is a little different than like people who had war crimes committed against them at Golden Nis, making those like actual characters in a story. On the other hand, with fantasy, if you're pulling historical elements into it, you get to decide how you get to morph it to fit into your fantasy context. And somehow she kind of sits right in the middle, but not in a way that like fully works for a lot of readers. And I think the more I sat with this, at first I was really like, Julia, it works. And now I'm like, I think it maybe doesn't work as well as I thought.
My feeling is historical fiction as a genre, the purpose it serves is Victoria's favorite thing about history, which is experiencing what ordinary people's life was like, because so much of our history is like, quote unquote, important people's names and places, right? And battles. And it's like, what were the ordinary people doing at home, or just like the 1 in a million soldiers in that battle or whatever? What was their experience? But it needs to follow history, roughly. I think some people play a little fast and loose with it, but the idea is like, this is actual history, but let's get a different perspective on real events. And then you have fantasy, which is like, it can be used to provide like metaphor or critique for things from the real world. The idea is that it's like totally unique. The promise of fantasy is that it is totally unique. It's a unique world to you, right? You can even get into like copyright issues, right? If it's not totally unique, and sort of an amalgamation of different cultural touch points in like a combination that no one's ever done before. To have a beat for beat retelling of real events that she like doesn't even allow herself the flexibility to morph things, or like even just the physical like map. She makes the map exactly the same, and the locations of the cities that get attacked exactly the same places. She restricts herself to actual history, but then she pretends it's fantasy, is kind of what it feels like before you kind of dive into her process.
My first thought when you were saying this was like, well, there are some really incredible retellings that are still considered like fantasy or towards that direction, more so than historical, like retellings of biblical stories or Greek mythology or other historical events that
like
have done
Circe
really well by being a retelling. Yeah, like Circe, I'm thinking of, where there's like a known text, like very well known in the Western world text of what that story is, and how did Madeline Miller play around with it in a way that worked differently. And my first thought was like, okay, is it just these events are more recent? But what felt different to you in that, like, retelling?
It hinges on she changes the names of everything. Genuinely, that's kind of what it boils down to for me. If she had kept all the names the same and added magic to this history, I think it might have worked for me.
Right. We have that all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, like, think of, like, Harry Potter, right? We've got, like, real city names, real geography, less, like, historical events happening. But, you know, it's just magic plopped on top of an existing
and
locale.
that people do that all the time. You think about Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, right? That's a really ridiculous one.
Yes.
But it's a real guy in a real place, and it sort of layers a magical element onto real events. It pretends to be like this alternative explanation for why... I haven't read that book. But it is that sort of...
I read the first 20% and I loved it. And I was reading too many vampire novels at the time to get back to it.
But it's like, the idea with those is if you add a magical element to history, it's sort of pretending... Like what Doctor Who does in their history episodes, is they, like, make you feel like, oh, we have the real story of what really happened, but you know it's... Literally, I think if she had kept the names of everything the same, and the Massacre of Spear, I think that's probably the thing that differs the most from history.
Mm-hmm.
If she had mapped that backstory a little bit more onto actual history, I think that might have worked for me. Like, it's not a unique perspective on a well-known myth. It's sort of an analogous retelling of, like, the rise of Mao Zedong, but specifically focusing on the parts of history that Japan doesn't acknowledge or that few people learn about, right? And all we've done is change the names of the people and the places. And Mao Zedong's a girl.
Yeah, it's like, what if Mao Zedong was a teenage girl, but then doesn't feel like that's really the focus of the retelling? Like, that she's a young girl. It's more that she has magic and rage.
Yes.
I'm starting to piece words around more of the critique here around like this thin layer of fantasy feels too thin in parts.
Yes.
And it's one thing to have like familiar names, but with a new POV, and it's another to use like familiar names and storylines, but like to land in kind of this confusing in between. Like, I was having a hard time understanding the Massacre of Spearley because I'm like, is this one real? How real is it? Are we real fantasy here? Because the powers of this people are very fantasy, but like, I don't know. And the thing today that really tipped me from like a 3.5 to 3-star rating is like, I finally put words to something that irked me, is that, again, I went in knowing just very vaguely that this was based off of real history, and I knew there was multiple Sino-Japanese wars, and so I didn't know which one that this was going to be based off of.
Yeah, same.
When we start in the world, it seems so old and technology is so far removed. It felt very fantasy in the sense of like Game of Thrones or something, where like we're not dealing with like cars and guns. We're dealing with swords and horses. Like, I felt like that was the vibe. And so I thought the history we were mapping onto was a lot older. But then when I start piecing the things together, especially the like explosion of the island of Mugen, which is basically the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, I was like, oh, that war. Whoa. And I think it ultimately does a disservice to the history by making it feel older, less recent, and maybe less directly impactful for today. And I think it unintentionally, I do not think this is Kuang's intentional, I think unintentionally reinforces the narrative like that was like an old time. That's like,
I didn't even think about that.
Because I forgot until today when I was reviewing my notes that I spent a lot of the book being like, I don't know what our comparative year is here. And I think that's maybe something she was trying to play with. Like, this is the fantasy element. It's like we're changing the technology and the weaponry. We're also allowing the story, especially in the future books, to be a little bit more accessible for folks like myself who I don't care to know a lot about how like military machinery of World War II worked. And I think this allows it to sit in that fantasy world that she wanted to, but I think because the world building was too mapped on to historical events, it just made it confusing. Instead of like, we're in a new place now. It was like, we're in the same place, but a different time, but not really, but kind of. Magic.
Her selectivity in what history she used and what she didn't wasn't like consistent enough. Like, she needed to go 10 toes down and pick one, you know? Your point about the bomb, her choice to use the magic element that she introduced to provide a fantastical version of the dropping of the atomic bomb and the devastation and the impact it had, and also the moral questions that it raises about having that kind of power, destructive power, and doing it from a distance, and like all those big questions, right? How ultimately like no one should have that. Mapping that onto our main character, who then accesses this massive magical power and commits the same amount of destruction kind of by herself, and has to deal with those same repercussions. And it also leads to the end of Japanese colonialism in a similar way that the dropping of the atomic bomb kind of eventually led to them leaving a lot of their colonies. Like, I thought that was a really clever translation. And it wasn't quite so one-to-one. And I'm like, if she had made more choices like that, where we're dealing with a lot of the same questions, but the map of the pacing of the war, where the war happens, how the war goes, doesn't follow history so rigidly, but is still inspired by it and still generates the same questions, just through a different medium, I think that could have been incredibly effective.
Circling back to how we talked about kind of the difference between the goals of historical fiction and the goals of fantasy, I think leaning more into the fantasy, where it's like using this completely different world to have moral and cultural and societal critiques or discussions about the world we live in. Like, we know what we're talking about here. Like, I think that's a moment where it comes through really well. It's like a strong fantasy element, and also a very helpful narrative choice that she doesn't have to come up with stand-ins for all the other world powers and dynamics of World War II that happened in history. She can say, we're trimming it down. So we only have like one stand-in for the West, which are the Hesperians. And we also, bring in that decision moment into our protagonist, which I think also kind of in the realm of revenge fantasy, right? It's putting that choice into that local character instead of this far-flung other nation. But still bringing those same questions into that conversation.
There's enough that she does well that there's still an argument about whether or not it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not just like
exactly
an abject failure.
In that case, we wouldn't be talking about this book because we wouldn't have read it. We wouldn't have known it existed.
Yeah, exactly. Talk to me about Rin, your frustrations with her, and like other people, how that got in the way of their reading experience.
So yes, I found like this increased as the books went on. And so for some folks, they may not get this in the first novel, but I did read quite a few reviews and like notes of people being like, I could not finish this book, the first one, because of Rin as a character. And there's a really great review. I love this person. Unfortunately teach their own. They decided to delete their Reddit account, so I don't even know. I can't even like credit their handle. But we'll link in the show notes this review. It's very detailed about what they thought was great about it, and then they go off on why they think Rin is terrible at the end, and just like Rin being an asshole. I found Rin to be annoying, but likable. And then some choices I was just like, ugh, okay, I can kind of see where she's coming from, but like just beyond unlikable in some ways. I will say that there are a lot of unlikable characters, unlikable protagonists that I think are really well done. Kuang herself, in one of her more recent novels, Yellowface, has a phenomenal first-person protagonist who is incredibly unlikable, but it really works in the novel. I think Rin is written a little too much to be the champion, that we really want to like her, but we also can't stand her. And I think sometimes it comes down to, for me, a lack of full character development and full relationship development. And so these moments where it's like, and now Rin's being stubborn, it feels like we've just like landed too hard on like one of her 3 strong personality traits in some decision-making moments. And it sometimes feels like overused, that she's just like, and now she's being stubborn. And now she's being like just angry. And I think 527 pages of anger Not that she doesn't have other emotions along the way, but it's really 527 pages of anger. It's just a lot to sit with. And because the action is so fast paced, it's just like we don't get a chance to be reminded about the other qualities of Rin that we enjoy, that we connect to. I feel like because we move so fast through some of these moments of pacing, like I felt sad that Alton died, but I did not feel the level of like devastation for Rin, because I'm like, what did you like about him? He kind of abused you and was not a great leader. Yes, he was like the last of your kind, but when did you bond about that? We only got that kind of in passing, that they were like more chummy.
Right. By the time he meets her, it's like assumed, and so they never talk about it.
Without giving away too much, Alton becomes someone that Rin is regular thinking about and interacting with her memory of him in her like shaman meditative state. So it's not actually Alton, like the character, but his presence is felt through the rest of the trilogy, and you're like, why do we care about him so much? Because I didn't get the character depth, the relationship depth in this first novel to really set up that he's going to be a like touchstone for her for the rest of the series. So again, this is a little colored by the fact that I read all three versus like just the first one, but I think we start to see traits in Rin that some develop as like a full character arc, and others I'm like we end up with just Rin being like, I'm angry. Here's my revenge plot. I also find her like, again, her relationship with Kate. He is, I don't think it gives anything away. They're together for the rest of the three books. Like, he's a main character in the first book. He continues to be a main character in the other books. After the university part at the beginning, when we establish like we're buddies, there's so many times when I'm like, why do they still, after all this time, yes, it's a familiar face, but like they're so connected as friends, and we don't, I think, do enough to reestablish and reconfirm the friendship throughout the novel. But I don't know how that felt to you. Again, I sat with these characters for a lot longer and I saw where they went. But in the first novel even, I remember being like, oh yeah, I remember him. We haven't seen him in so long. Yeah. And they're like, together. But he's also kind of her foil, right? Like he's like counter to her, but in the end, still allies with her.
It didn't bother me too much in the first one that he shows up at the end because she found him at Golan Nice. Honestly, similar with Neja, right? She and Neja like go through a couple really traumatizing experiences together.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like all is forgiven in a way. Not really, but kind of. And I felt like similarly with Kate, like they haven't seen each other in a long time, but we did really establish, they have a whole chapter, just them hanging out. And I think because she finds him in this really horrifying low moment and rescues him, quote unquote, but also they see this devastation. I don't know, that kind of explained it to me, that now they're kind of trauma bonded for life, even if they disagree on a lot.
No, yeah, that makes sense.
That didn't bother me too much. Though I do think it's a pattern with Kuang's writing, and this was one of our frustrations with Babel, which was that, like, she kind of assumed that, okay, we had this one scene way back in the first third of the book that establishes their relationship, or we don't have one until, like, the very end, and we just are sort of supposed to buy that they have these deep emotional connections, either for a reason that we saw way long ago in our reading experience, or that we just saw right before this really harrowing thing happened to both of them. And, like, yeah, her pacing of, like, friendships and relationships, I think it might be one of her weakest writing traits. So I'm very curious to see how she evolves as a writer. My other thought is that the characterization of Rin and Alton a bit, to me, feel like one of the biggest things. I mean, you read that whole passage from Rin's perspective in response of her thoughts about Golan Nice, right? Where she kind of starts preaching. I feel like Rin's characterization is what suffers the most because of how this book was written. Often when you're in that kind of emotional place writing fiction, you can put a lot of yourself and your own feelings into a character or events or whatever and get really attached to certain thoughts or feelings or certain bits of the character or the character themselves in order to represent you properly. And sometimes you can't take a step back as a result and see what the character needs as a separate entity and what journey they need to go on. And I think also she was a bit bound by, again, actual historical events of what Rin needed to do and where she needed to be. That it just makes her a little bit choppy. Maybe the rage feels artificial sometimes in this character, but it was very real for Kuang.
Shall we talk about what worked?
Yes, please.
Yeah, as much as we were sitting here like picking apart the nuances of what didn't work, we obviously both found enjoyment in this novel that we just like could not put it down and just read it super fast. You know, on one hand, ironically, one of the reasons a lot of people loved the book was the exact same reason we discussed before. It was like the blending of historical and the fantasy and the fact that the book is a retelling of the real and often forgotten history. So I think it worked for a lot of readers, even if you and I had a lot of long discussion about like, was this working? For many, it did. Folks who both knew the events and were like, I'm really excited to see the representation of these stories, this history, in a setting that a lot of folks will read who may not pick up like a historical book of nonfiction, as well as people who didn't know the story. And in their reviews were like, wow, gripping, fantasy story. On top of it, I learned something about history that I didn't know.
And I'm like so on board for her mission to bring this buried history to the masses, right? I'm like 100% on board. This is a great purpose. It's a really important story to tell, and I'm glad someone decided to tell it. Yeah, absolutely. Like you were saying, like the kind of book that someone will absolutely pick up this book who would never pick up her sort of reference material.
While we might have qualms with some of the characterization and the depths of relationships, like what Kuang does so well is write excellent action novels. And the pacing and the writing that just keeps you like sucked in. You and I are not alone in like people reviewing this book saying like, I read it in like 2 weeks. I couldn't put it down. Like I haven't read anything this fast ever. Yeah. And I pull just like, and there's also just like these moments where like characters get to do something that's like, I don't know, just little moments that stick with you. And this is one of my favorites from earlier in the novel when they're like the students of the university are like helping with evacuations. Sir, Kate asked. The magistrate turned to look at him. What? With a grunt, Kate raised the crate over his head and flung it to the ground. It landed on the dirt with a hard thud, not the tremendous crash Rin had rather been hoping for. The wooden lid of the crate popped off. Out rolled several very nice porcelain teapots glazed with a lovely flower pattern. Despite their tumble, they looked unbroken. Then Kate took to them with a slab of wood. When he was done smashing them, he pushed his wiry curls out of his face and whirled on the sweating magistrate, who cringed in his seat as if afraid Kate might start smashing at him too. We are at war, Kate said, and you are being evacuated because for gods know what reason you've been deemed important to this country's survival. So do your job, reassure your people, help us maintain order. Do not pack your fucking teapots. It's just like, she writes dialogue, she writes action in a way that you're just like, boom, boom, boom. I love it. And like just enough detail to pull you into a moment, but not like sweeping descriptions of the countryside that are gonna like make you glaze over. And like little moments like this too, I think, where we get to see the characters just like be angry and kick ass, but like at a very particular reason that's kind of funny.
Yeah. You can see how good her instincts are and like how good she is capable of being at characterization. This is such a good character moment for Kate. It's a pretty jarring transition when like all of a sudden the country gets invaded and we're suddenly changing genres of novel from like a school novel to a war novel. And so it kind of like, in order to help us with that transition, we're with Rin and Kate doing like really boring stuff, evacuating people, and you don't really feel the gravity of it yet. And so like this moment really helps. Like, I feel like some of the small things are what she does really well. And she just writes some like really fucking good sentences. You pulled a couple great quotes. Hate was a funny thing. It gnawed at her insides like poison. It made every muscle in her body tense, made her veins boil so hot she thought her head might split in half, and yet it fueled everything she did. Hate was its own kind of fire, and if you had nothing else, it kept you warm. So good.
Excellent.
She's so good at sentence rhythm, if that makes sense. Like, you never feel like you're getting stuck in a spot anywhere reading her books. And I think that's part of why you just keep reading, because it just like flows like water. Like you just, her rhythm is just so good. And she's got such a natural instinct for it. It's really incredible.
So yeah, even when you're sitting there being like, I don't know if I like this character, I feel confused about this blending of history and fantasy, and I was really jarred by this like transition from school to war novel, which a lot of people critiqued. Julie and I just blew past it. I think it worked. It was fine. Even with all those like hesitations or like, I don't know about this, I feel like, the writing itself is what keeps you going. Because I'm like, well, I'm enjoying reading it. Like the experience of reading is good. And I am really curious to see where Kuang takes this. Yes, I will finish the entire trilogy. And I'm glad I did. I didn't want to stop with just the first novel. I was like, I need to know more, even if I'm like, I'm starting to have thoughts about why I didn't like it. Because I did take quite a break between novel 1 and novel 2, and then an even bigger break before novel 3. My 4.75 rating had already started dipping a little bit but before I even started reading books 2 and 3, but I'm still very glad I did. So what's the verdict? Who do we think would enjoy this book? What's our recommendation?
I think people who are on the same journey that Kuang was on when she wrote it are gonna gobble this up. Young people in powerful countries, I'm thinking probably college students, right? They're starting to unlearn the propagandistic limited history that they were given by their government or public education or whatever. Because every government does this. There is no guiltless government when it comes to history, especially if you're in a really powerful country. There's going to be some unlearning that happens when you become an adult. And so if you're going through that and you're filled with this rage and this desire to learn, what else haven't they been telling me? You'd really latch onto this book and benefit from it and connect to it and enjoy it. And they might even connect to Rin's rage, right? And it might feel totally natural to them. And there's this feeling of like you're discovering a dark secret. There's some excitement, feeling like, oh, this is like hidden and I'm uncovering it. My final conclusion is that it's not about whether the book is good or bad. It's that it works best as a discovery, not a rehashing. That's my final thought.
I will +1 to what you said. I think other categories of folks who might enjoy this would be if you're really into grim dark fantasy, which honestly was not a subgenre I was familiar with until I started researching for this episode. So like dark fantasy that deals with like
Game of Thrones
nihilism.
Is the classic
Game of Thrones, classic one. If you're into that genre and you haven't read it, like definitely read it, check it out, because I think it is a really interesting part of the genre. And some of the reviews that I read that were really praising of it are from the perspective of someone who reads a lot of grim dark fantasy. They're like,
interesting.
But to be honest, I don't really read this genre much, so I don't know how much to compare it to. Maybe the grim dark fantasy fans are like, okay, there was like 3 of us who liked this book, but the rest of us didn't. I don't know.
That did really tickle my brain, you mentioning grimdark. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I was like, I mean, because what people like about grimdark is that they're like, oh, this is like real. It's sort of the anti-Tolkien is the idea, right? Tolkien is like, ultimately good and love will prevail against all darkness and fellowship and right? The ultimate goodness of the universe. And grimdark is kind of the opposite. And it's like, no, this is real, right? This is what reality is like, and we're not going to sugarcoat, right? But it's interesting that a book that's basically a retelling of history is categorized as grimdark. That was like, oh, that is interesting. And I feel like maybe the grimdark fans would latch onto that because it's real. It's real.
My other smaller category of folks, I mean, I don't think it's smaller in numbers, but I have less to say about it, is just like if you're looking to binge something and there's like a lot of fantasy series out there to binge, I would say this one probably has a little bit more meat, a little bit more like thoughtful writing than some of the other long bingeable series out there. And so I think especially if you read a lot of that churning through fantasy novel kind of experience, I think this one will be kind of refreshing. And it's like just how different it is compared to other, like, I'm not saying binging in a bad way, but binging in the sense of like, I can't put this book down, I'm going to read it for 3 days straight. Like that kind of writing style that you just like, I'm going. Like it's got that writing style. It's got that feel you'll probably really enjoy. But I think it might have a little bit more meat to the story, a lot of difference compared to what other types of books are usually in that like multiple book bingeable series state. To wrap us up here, recommendations. So if you did read The Poppy War, You were already convinced, or we have convinced you, and you read it, and then you came back to this episode. What would you recommend that folks check out next?
So there are the 3 big history texts that Kuang in the end material mentions that she read and referenced. You might want to read The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II by Iris Chong. That reflects the Golan Nice chapter. There's also Shanghai 1937, Stalingrad on the Yangtze by Peter Harmson. That's the Battle of Coeur d'Alene chapter. And then we have Comfort Women, Sexual Slavery in the Japanese Military During World War II by Yoshimi Yoshiaki. And that is only briefly touched on by the experience of Vanka, but it is a huge and important thing to learn about and a really horrible thing that the Japanese military did. A non-fiction book I would recommend if you want some different history. You unearthed this history, you're like, I'm done learning about this, but I want something similar that's going to kind of unpick the veneer of American exceptionalism or something. I would recommend The Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins. It's about what America did during the Cold War to most of the global south. And then if you want to read fiction, Golden Compass by Philip Pullman, Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, and The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. Read the new one, too, Sunrise on the Reaping. If you want fantasy that is directly critiquing without being an exact copy of real events, that's the one.
So if you've read the Poppy Wars but haven't finished the trilogy, go read the rest of the trilogy. Spread it out. It's a lot of books. You could also read it all in one go, but that might be a lot. If you want more Kuang, especially like anti-colonialism, Babel is fantastic. We had another episode on that one where we said a very similar thing that we said in this episode, which is like, we loved this so much. Here's 1 hour of us critiquing it. But we loved it. Why do we keep
doing
I
this?
know.
Kuang, we love you, I promise.
I always recommend the books. So for other authors that I'm looking forward to checking out, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke is another massive historical fantasy. It's been on my list for a long time. The book intimidates me. It's huge. So someday I will. I'm going to read it on my e-reader so that I don't have to see how many pages it is. And then another one's been on my list for a while, but I learned more recently has a bit of a historical flair. I thought it was just fantasy, is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. Cool. And to close out every episode, we talk about literally anything else besides this book. What are you currently obsessed with? What is bringing you joy these days?
Bon Iver's new album.
So good.
So good. Actively watching Hacks season 4. I would really recommend Deli Boys on Hulu. And then The Pit. Oh my god.
Everyone's talking about this.
Yes. It's apparently the most accurate medical drama ever created. It's so incredibly made. So it's kind of like the 24 format where each episode is an hour of a day, of a shift. I mean, there's certain parts that are a bit gross. Like, they made super accurate prosthetics. So you're, like, up in there, and there's some, like, shins that get removed and shit. Like, sometimes is gross. I had to turn away a few times, for sure. So watch it slowly.
Total change of tone, but Trader Joe's has a goat milk Gouda cheese that I've been really enjoying.
Yeah.
It's got the nice, like, consistency and creamy, but, like, firm cheese texture of Gouda, but a little bit of, like, the flavor profile of goat milk. 2 books I've been reading for reasons I don't think we'll ever do on the show, so I'm recommending them here. True to You, A Therapist's Guide to Stop People Pleasing and Start Being Yourself by Dr. Kathleen Smith has been super helpful in my own personal journey.
Oh, yeah,
but as we discussed today, sometimes you can't create content about things that are a little too close to home. So catch us in 2035 when maybe we talk about that book if it still feels relevant. And I've, like, learned enough from it to have some distance.
Yeah. You don't want to have, like, a therapy session hour where we, like, let's unpack Victoria's people pleasing.
Yeah, we'll do, like, all the worksheets together where we have to talk about our family dynamics. The therapist that wrote the book in a very accessible way and with lots of really wonderful examples and worksheets and, like, things to work through takes Bowen family systems therapy and walks you through it and adds some additional elements to it, and then is also very self-aware of, like, if you picked up this book, you're probably the kind of person who just, like, goes to other people and to other books and to podcasts to try to find, like, direction because you maybe don't have a great sense of your own self. And it's very self-aware being like, this is not a book that's going to change your life unless you do work. And even then, it's not going to be the book that did it. It's you.
Called out.
And I was like, too close to home. And lastly, I just finished reading Cat and Bird by Kyoko Mori. It's a really wonderful memoir meets reflection on grief, all about pets. There are 2 cats on the cover that look like my 2 cats.
Oh, no.
And so I picked up the book, and it's wonderful. It's so good. I just think if you own specifically a cat or you live with a cat, you will enjoy this book. Really just celebrates the special bond between pets and their humans. Maybe because I'm a new cat owner, I have yet to find all these books about cats. I just feel like there's not a lot of books about cats that aren't like a magical sidekick or like just there.
I feel like the Japanese have a much deeper tradition of praising cats in writing.
Maybe we'll do a bonus episode that's just about cats.
Yeah, that might be fun, actually.
I'll bring a bunch of books.
Yeah, that'd be good. All right, signing off.
Until next time.
We don't know what we're reading next, so that'll be fun.
Love in the Big City.
Oh, you finished it?
I have it on my Kindle to read on the plane. I read most of it.
You keep putting it off. It's so funny.
I got it though. I got it on my Kindle. Okay. It's downloaded. My Kindle's charged. It's happening.
Okay.
It's happening.
It's happening. Great. All right. See y'all next time.
This has been an episode of Book Club with Julia and Victoria. A huge thank you to all of our members who keep the show going. You can also join the membership and support the show to receive special access to our film club, newsletters, and the archive of the first 50 episodes. You can find all that and more at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick. Our logo was designed by Gabby Febland. We want to know what you're reading and your bookish thoughts, so you can reach us at our website, bookclubwithjv.com, on Instagram at bookclubwithjv, or by leaving a review on Apple or Spotify. We'll catch you next time. Happy reading.